He was a wealthy single father and never allowed anyone into their little world. Illness broke his strength, and only a nurse was with his daughter in the hospital. Everything changed the moment he heard the girl call her Mom. See how this story ends. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. David Miller had built his life on order. His colleagues admired him for his discipline. His employees respected his vision, and the world saw him as a man who seemed to have mastered every detail of his days. Yet behind the polished offices, the chauffeured cars, and the carefully managed schedule, there was only one constant that mattered to him: his daughter, Emily. She was the light that remained after tragedy, the fragile yet steady reminder that he was still alive after losing his wife. He had buried himself in work not because he loved it more than anything, but because it allowed him to keep breathing, to fill the silence at night, to keep the grief from consuming him. Emily was only 8 years old, a lively child with curious eyes and a habit of asking questions that made David pause in the middle of board meetings or while reading through contracts at home. She carried her late mother's kindness in her smile, but there was always something missing when she laughed, as if the sound waited for an echo that never came. David tried to be both father and mother, but he knew there were places in her heart he couldn't reach, no matter how many bedtime stories he read or how many Saturday mornings he dedicated to pancakes and cartoons. That winter began like any other. The meetings stacked up one after another. Late nights at the office bled into mornings of rushed school drop-offs. Yet David had grown used to the fatigue, treating it as the price of success and survival. Until one morning, when his body betrayed him, he woke up drenched in sweat, his chest heavy, his breath shallow. Emily stood in the doorway clutching her school bag, her little face pale with worry. He tried to reassure her with a smile, but the cough ripped through his body, bending him forward, stealing the strength from his frame. At the office, he forced himself through half a meeting before the room tilted. His assistants panicked, rushing for help, and within an hour he was in an ambulance. Emily clutching his hand with both of hers, tears streaking her cheeks. He remembered little of the ride beyond the fear in her eyes. For a man who had always been the unshakable center of his daughter's world, lying helpless on a stretcher was a humiliation more painful than the illness itself. The hospital was sterile and foreign. The walls glared white, the scent of antiseptic clung to every breath, and the echo of hurried footsteps reminded him that here he was not in control. He was a patient, another body to be examined, treated, and contained. Emily refused to leave his side, curling into the chair by his bed as though her small presence could shield him. He tried to reassure her, but his own voice betrayed how weak he felt. For the first time since his wife's death, he wondered if he might fail his daughter, if his body might give up before he was ready. The doctors delivered the verdict with calm efficiency: pneumonia, severe enough to require a long stay in the hospital. David nodded, his business instincts telling him to accept the facts, to plan around them. But as the IV drip was attached to his arm and the steady rhythm of the monitor filled the silence, the reality pressed down. He was trapped in bed, tethered to machines, and his little girl was stranded in the cold fluorescent world of a hospital, with no one to comfort her but him, and he was too weak to manage it. That was when the nurse entered. She wasn't remarkable at first glance, not in the way David was used to noticing people. She wore the same pale scrubs as the others, her hair pulled back, a clipboard in hand. But there was something about her presence, the way her eyes softened when they fell on Emily sitting stiffly in the corner. Her voice was low, steady, almost melodic as she introduced herself. She checked David's vitals, adjusted the IV, wrote a note on her chart. Then, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, she crouched down to Emily's level. "You've been very brave today," she said gently. "Would you like some apple juice? Or maybe a storybook to pass the time?" Emily blinked, caught off guard by the attention. She nodded slowly. The nurse smiled, disappearing for a moment before returning with a small cup and a battered children's book from the staff lounge. She handed them over, and Emily whispered a thank you so soft that David barely heard it. For the first time all day, his daughter's shoulders relaxed. That night, David dozed under the haze of medication. When he woke again, the room was dim, and he saw Emily sitting cross-legged on the floor, crayons scattered around her, while the nurse read aloud from the book, her voice carrying warmth into the sterile room. David's chest tightened, not from the illness, but from something else he couldn't name. Gratitude, perhaps, or the ache of realizing how much his daughter needed moments like this. In the days that followed, the nurse her name was Claire appeared regularly. She wasn't assigned solely to him, but she always made time to check in on Emily. She remembered her favorite juice, brought her extra paper for drawing, even taught her how to fold a paper crane during a quiet afternoon. Emily's laughter returned, bright and unguarded, as if the hospital were just another place to play. David watched all of it with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was relieved, even thankful. He had been terrified that Emily would suffer from his weakness, that these sterile days would etch fear into her. Instead, she was smiling. On the other hand, part of him resisted. He had built a wall around his private life, determined to keep strangers out. Yet here was someone, slipping through the cracks simply by caring. One evening, as Emily drifted to sleep, with her head resting on the edge of his bed, Claire quietly adjusted the blanket around her. David stirred, his voice low. "You don't have to do all this," he murmured. Claire glanced at him, her expression calm. "She shouldn't have to sit here alone while you recover. Kids remember these moments. They remember who made them feel safe." Her words lingered long after she left the room. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint rhythm of his daughter's breathing, and realized how rare it was for someone to speak to him without calculation or expectation. It was disarming, unsettling, and strangely comforting all at once. The days blended into each other, measured by IV bags and checkups, by Emily's drawings taped along the wall, and by the quiet moments when Claire found time to sit with them. Slowly, David's body began to heal. The fever subsided, the cough loosened, and his strength returned. Yet with every step of recovery, he noticed how much his daughter reached for Claire, her hand, her smile, her presence. And with every passing day, his own resistance began to weaken. The hospital, once a place of fear and confinement, had become something else, a fragile cocoon where his daughter laughed again, where a stranger's kindness filled the gaps he had been unable to bridge. And though he would not admit it yet, David felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, something he had not allowed himself since the day he lost his wife. It was not hope exactly, but it was close. He knew one thing for certain as he closed his eyes that night. When he left the hospital, life would not be the same. The days inside the hospital began to fall into a rhythm that David had never expected. At first, every hour was marked by the sound of machines, the presence of doctors, and the fatigue that weighed down his body. But as his fever broke and his strength returned, the stillness of the room gave way to something else, an unfolding pattern of small moments, shaped not just by his recovery, but by the presence of the woman who had quietly stepped into his and Emily's world. Claire never acted as though she was doing anything extraordinary. She moved through the ward with calm efficiency, tending to patients, recording vitals, adjusting equipment. Yet whenever she passed by their room, she paused, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a small gift for Emily, and more often with a few words that seemed to ease the sharp edges of each day. Emily began to look forward to those visits with an eagerness that David could not ignore. In the mornings, while he was still drowsy from the medications, she would ask if Claire had started her shift yet. In the afternoons, when the hours stretched long, Emily would hover near the doorway, waiting for the familiar figure in pale scrubs to appear. It was as though Claire carried with her a piece of normal life, a reminder that not everything was defined by illness or loneliness. For a child who had lived so long with the quiet absence of her mother, that reminder was precious. David told himself that he was grateful. He told himself that the relief he felt was nothing more than appreciation for someone who cared enough to notice his daughter in the sterile halls of the hospital. And yet each time he caught sight of Emily laughing in Claire's company, he felt a twist inside him, something between gratitude and unease. He had worked so hard to be everything for his daughter, to build a fortress around the two of them. Watching another person step into that space unsettled him, but there was no denying that Claire made the days bearable. Emily returned to her homework with more focus when Claire promised to check it. She ate her meals with more enthusiasm when Claire sat with her. In the small hospital courtyard, where winter sunlight filtered through bare branches, Claire taught her how to play a simple clapping game, and the sound of Emily's laughter echoed across the concrete walls. David observed it all, torn between the pride of seeing his daughter happy and the ache of realizing he could not provide that happiness on his own. One evening, after Emily had finally fallen asleep with her head against his arm, Claire lingered by the doorway. She checked the monitors, straightened the blanket, and then looked at David with a thoughtful expression. "She's doing better than most children would," she said softly, "but she's carrying a lot for someone her age. You must have done more than you realize to keep her so steady." David wanted to respond with something polished, something that fit the image of control he always projected. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he found himself saying quietly, "I don't know that I've done enough. I've tried, but she lost her mother so young. I can't give her everything she needs." Claire's gaze softened. "No one can give a child everything. What matters is that she knows you're here, that she can trust you to be her constant." Her words struck him with a quiet force. He nodded, unable to speak further, and when she slipped away into the hallway, he was left with the weight of her observation. He wondered if Emily truly saw him as her constant, or if she was already reaching for someone else to fill the void that lingered in her small heart. The next day, that worry deepened. He woke from a light sleep to the sound of Emily's giggles. At the foot of the bed, Claire sat cross-legged on the floor, braiding Emily's hair with patient hands. Emily held a mirror, watching as her hair transformed into two neat plaits. "Mom used to do this," Emily said suddenly, her voice soft but steady. "I remember it a little." David's chest tightened. He braced himself for the ache that always followed those words. But Claire didn't flinch. She smiled gently, tying the ends with bright elastic bands. "She must have been very good at it," she said. "You have such beautiful hair. It deserves to be cared for like this." Emily smiled shyly, and David felt his throat constrict. For so long he had dreaded these moments. Any mention of his late wife, any reminder of what had been taken from them. But Claire had met it with grace, neither ignoring nor overstepping, simply honoring the memory without trying to replace it. That was when he realized that his unease was slowly giving way to something else. As the days passed, the connection between Emily and Claire grew stronger. They developed routines that seemed almost ordinary. Homework in the afternoon, coloring before dinner, a short walk through the courtyard if the weather allowed. Claire taught Emily how to fold paper cranes, how to count heartbeats with a stethoscope, even how to tie a proper knot in her shoelaces. Each time, Emily beamed as though she were being given the keys to a secret world. David found himself watching more often than he admitted. He watched the way Claire crouched to Emily's level when she spoke, how she listened as though every word mattered, how she guided without forcing. And he watched the way Emily leaned into her, trusting her instinctively. He had not seen that kind of ease in his daughter since his wife had passed. One night, long after visiting hours had ended and the halls had quieted, Emily woke with a start. She had dreamed, she said between sobs, that David was gone. Her small hands clutched his, her tears soaking into his sleeve. He tried to soothe her, but his own body still ached, his voice hoarse. It was Claire who came quickly when she heard the crying. She knelt beside the bed, her presence calm and steady, and took Emily's hand in hers. Without hesitation, she began to hum a lullaby, her voice low and melodic. Slowly, Emily's sobs quieted, her breathing eased, and she drifted back into sleep with her hands still clasped in Claire's. David lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of that lullaby fading into silence. Something in him shifted then, though he could not name it. For the first time in years, he felt less alone in carrying the weight of his daughter's grief. In the days that followed, he began to open up in ways he had not expected. One afternoon, as Claire adjusted his IV, he found himself speaking about his wife, about the illness that had taken her so quickly, about the months of hope and despair, about the morning when everything had changed forever. The words came haltingly at first, then with a force he could not stop. Claire listened without interrupting, her eyes steady, her expression marked by empathy rather than pity. When he finished, silence filled the room. For a moment, David regretted speaking, afraid that he had revealed too much. But then Claire said quietly, "You've carried more than most people ever should. No wonder you're tired. It's not weakness to feel the weight. It's human." Her words lingered long after she left. David turned them over in his mind, realizing how rare it was for anyone to speak to him with such honesty. He was used to deference, to people measuring their words around him. But Claire seemed to see through the titles, through the wealth and the reputation, to the man who had been holding on for his daughter's sake. By the end of the second week, the hospital no longer felt like a prison. It had become, in its own strange way, a place of transformation. Emily thrived under Claire's care, her laughter filling the halls. David, though still wary, began to see that perhaps he was not failing his daughter as he had feared. Perhaps for the first time in years, he was allowing someone else to share the burden he had carried alone. As he lay in bed one evening, the sound of Emily's quiet breathing beside him, David realized that his perspective had shifted. The hospital stay had begun as a battle against illness, but it was becoming something else entirely, a test of his heart, of his willingness to let another person step inside the fragile world he had built. And though he did not know it yet, that choice would soon confront him in a way he could not ignore. The hospital had become less of a place of sickness and more of a strange sort of refuge. By the time David's strength began to return, and he was walking without assistance down the polished hallways, he realized how much the days had changed him. What had begun as an ordeal marked by weakness and frustration had slowly reshaped into something softer, more complicated. The sterile rooms had filled with Emily's laughter, with the presence of Claire's calm voice, with the fragile peace of moments that didn't feel borrowed but real. And yet beneath that comfort, a tension had begun to gather quietly, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. It was a gray morning when David decided to take a walk beyond the short distance between his room and the cafeteria. His body was still frail, his steps measured, but he wanted to feel movement, to remind himself that he was no longer chained to the bed. Emily had disappeared into the playroom near the pediatric wing, a place filled with small tables, boxes of crayons, and scattered toys. David's plan was simply to glance through the door, make sure she was safe, and continue down the corridor. But as he approached, he slowed, drawn by the sound that drifted into the hallway, the sound of his daughter's laughter, clear and unrestrained, the kind of laughter he had not heard in years. He paused by the door unseen. Inside, Emily sat on the floor with Claire, a tower of colored blocks rising between them. Claire's hair had slipped loose from its clip, falling softly against her cheek as she leaned down to Emily's level. Her voice carried warmth as she encouraged Emily to balance the final piece at the top of their creation. Emily's little hands trembled with concentration, her tongue caught between her teeth. When the block finally settled without the tower collapsing, she clapped her hands in triumph and flung her arms around Claire's neck. And then David heard it. One word spoken with all the innocence of a child who had been missing something so essential that when she finally felt it again, she gave it a name. Emily whispered, "Thank you, Mommy." The word struck him harder than any fever, sharper than any pain. He froze in the doorway, his chest tight, his breath caught somewhere between anger and grief. For a moment he thought he must have misheard, but then Emily repeated it, softer this time, her face pressed against Claire's shoulder. David's mind reeled. That word belonged to only one person, the woman he had loved and lost, the woman whose absence had carved a hollow in both his and Emily's lives. To hear it now, directed at someone else, felt like a betrayal of memory, a wound torn open in a place he thought had scarred over. His instinct was to step inside, to correct Emily, to remind her that her mother could never be replaced. But as he stood there, paralyzed, his eyes fell on the expression on Emily's face. Peaceful, safe, radiant, in a way he hadn't seen since before the funeral. Conflicted, he leaned against the wall outside the door, his hands pressed tightly to his sides. Part of him wanted to storm away, to bury the hurt, to tell himself that this was dangerous, unacceptable, impossible. Yet another part, quieter but no less insistent, whispered that what he had just witnessed was not betrayal but yearning. Emily wasn't forgetting her mother. She was reaching for the love she remembered, even in fragments, and had found it, if only for a moment, in Claire's embrace. He stood there until his legs ached, until the weight in his chest threatened to consume him. Finally, unable to carry the silence any longer, he stepped into the room. Both Claire and Emily looked up, startled. Emily's face broke into a smile, and she leapt to her feet, tugging at Claire's hand as though she wanted to share her triumph with him. "Daddy, look! We built the tallest tower and it didn't fall." David forced a smile, his voice rough. "I see that. It's impressive." His eyes, however, shifted to Claire, and she seemed to understand what he had heard. There was a flicker of something in her gaze. Apology, uncertainty, perhaps even fear, but she did not speak. Later that day, when Emily had finally drifted into an exhausted nap, David found Claire near the nurse's station. She was writing on a chart, her posture stiff, her expression carefully neutral. He approached slowly, his heart still heavy. "We need to talk," he said quietly. She set the chart down and met his gaze, her voice calm but edged with caution. "About what happened earlier?" He nodded, his throat tight. She called you, Mommy." The word caught in his mouth, leaving behind an ache. Did you encourage that?" Claire's eyes widened, and for the first time since he had known her, she looked almost offended. "No, of course not. She said it on her own. I didn't want her to. I would never try to take that place." David studied her face, searching for any hint of falsehood, but found none. She continued, her voice softer now. "I know what that word means. I know it belongs to someone else. But children, they see things differently. They feel love and safety, and sometimes they give it a name. She wasn't trying to replace her mother. She was reaching for something she's missed." Her words echoed the same realization that had struck him earlier, though hearing them aloud did little to ease the tension inside him. He swallowed hard, his hands clenching at his sides. It's difficult for me. That word," he stopped, his voice breaking. "It belonged to my wife. Hearing it again, in that way, it's..." Claire's expression softened. She stepped closer, not too close, but enough that he felt the steadiness of her presence. "I understand, and I don't want to cause you pain. But please believe me when I say that I didn't invite it. Emily chose it, and all I could do was hold her in that moment. I can't undo her feelings. I can only make sure she knows she's safe." Silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. David nodded slowly, the storm inside him quieting just enough to breathe. "I know you didn't mean for it to happen. I don't know how to process it." "You don't have to," Claire replied gently. "You just have to remember that she's a little girl who's lost more than most children ever should. If she sees something in me that comforts her, let it be that. It doesn't erase her mother. Nothing ever could." Her honesty left him without words. For the first time, he saw not just the nurse who had filled the gaps in their days, but the woman who carried her own quiet strength, who had the grace to step into their brokenness without demanding anything in return. That night, as David lay in bed with Emily curled against his side, he replayed the moment over and over in his mind. Her small voice whispering that word, the look of peace on her face, the steadiness of Claire's reply. He realized that his anger had not been truly directed at Claire, or even at Emily. It had been aimed at the emptiness that had haunted them since the funeral, at the fear that letting anyone in would mean letting his wife's memory fade. But watching Emily that day, he knew the truth. His daughter wasn't forgetting her mother. She was remembering what it felt like to be loved like that, and finding it again, in a way he had never been able to give her alone. The realization frightened him, but it also offered something he hadn't expected, a possibility, a chance that maybe, just maybe, the walls he had built around their lives didn't have to stand forever. And though he would not admit it yet, deep down he knew that nothing could be the same again. The hospital that had once seemed like a place of confinement had turned into something else entirely, a place where life had been reshaped in ways David could not have predicted. Weeks earlier, he had entered its doors weak, fevered, and afraid of what would happen to his daughter if he failed her. Now, as his health steadily returned and the doctors finally spoke of discharge, he found himself unprepared for what came next. The thought of leaving did not bring the relief he had expected. Instead, it brought an ache, because leaving meant change, and change meant facing what had taken root in the sterile corridors between the three of them. Emily clung to the news of his recovery with joy, but her joy was not whole. She smiled when the doctor said they could prepare to go home, but her eyes quickly darted to Claire, and in that glance David saw a fear he recognized too well, the fear of losing something precious just as it had been found. That evening, as he packed the few belongings that had accumulated on the nightstand and the chair the stack of Emily's drawings, a book Claire had read to her, a blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed, he caught his daughter staring at Claire with a sadness that pierced him. When the time came, the nurse stood quietly by the doorway while the doctor handed David his discharge papers. The conversation was brisk, practical, filled with instructions about medication and follow-ups. But as soon as the doctor left, silence fell over the room. Emily slipped her hand into Claire's, holding on tightly. David watched them, torn between gratitude and hesitation, his heart caught in a place he had never allowed it to rest before. On the drive home, Emily barely spoke. She clutched one of the paper cranes Claire had folded for her, turning it over and over in her hands. When they reached the house, she ran to her room without a word. The silence was heavy, and David felt it pressing on him long after he had settled into the familiar surroundings of home. Everything was as it had been before. Polished floors, carefully arranged furniture, the framed photographs of his late wife, but it all seemed emptier now, as though the walls themselves had grown aware of what they lacked. 2 days later, unable to ignore the weight in his chest or the look in his daughter's eyes, David made a decision. He called Claire. His voice was careful, almost formal, as he thanked her again for everything she had done. But before he could end the call, the words came out almost against his will. Would you have dinner with us? Nothing formal, just dinner. I think Emily would like it. I think I would too. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment he feared she would refuse. But then she agreed, her voice calm, but tinged with something he couldn't quite name. Relief washed through him. When Claire arrived that evening, Emily lit up with a joy that erased the quiet sorrow of the past days. She ran to her, tugging her into the living room, showing her drawings pinned to the wall, the toys scattered across the rug. David watched from a distance, the knot in his chest loosening as he saw his daughter's laughter return. Over dinner, the conversation flowed more easily than he had imagined. Claire spoke about her years as a nurse, about the children she had comforted in the ward, about the small joys that made the long shifts bearable. Emily filled in the gaps with chatter while David listened, realizing how rare it was for their home to feel so alive. After Emily had gone to bed, leaving behind a trail of crayons and stuffed animals, David and Claire remained at the table. The quiet stretched, but it was not uncomfortable. At last he spoke, his voice low. I watched you with her in the hospital. You did more than care for her. You gave her something she hasn't had in years. Claire shook her head gently. I didn't do anything extraordinary. She just needed someone to listen, to hold her when she was scared. David leaned forward, his gaze steady. You don't understand. I've tried so hard to be both father and mother. But when I saw her with you, I realized how much she was missing and how much I was missing too. You've been more than a nurse. You've been family whether you intended to or not. Her expression faltered then, uncertainty flashing across her face. David, I live a very different life than you. I don't belong in this world of yours. You're wealthy, respected. I'm just me. I don't know if I could ever fit. He shook his head, his voice firm but soft. That doesn't matter. What matters is that my daughter smiles when you're here, that I can breathe easier when you're near. I've built my life on things that look strong on the outside, but none of it means anything without what I've seen these past weeks. Without you. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Claire lowered her eyes, her hands folded tightly in her lap. But then she lifted her gaze, meeting his with a steadiness that echoed the moment she had once soothed his daughter in the night. I don't want to take someone else's place, she said. You wouldn't be, he answered quietly. My wife will always be part of us. But we can't live only in the shadow of loss. We need something new, something real, and I think Emily has already chosen. The weeks that followed blurred into a new rhythm. Claire began to visit more often, first under the pretense of helping Emily with homework, then for meals, then simply because the absence felt wrong. David found himself adjusting, not just to her presence, but to the sense of wholeness that had returned to his home. Emily flourished, her laughter filling the rooms that had long been too quiet. One evening as they sat together on the couch, Emily nestled between them. She reached out and took both their hands. She looked up at her father with a smile that held no hesitation, no fear, only certainty. "This feels right," she whispered. David looked at Claire then, and in that moment he understood what had been growing between them. It was not about replacing the past. It was about building a future. He squeezed his daughter's hand, then Claire's, and for the first time in years, the ache in his chest eased. The hospital had been a place of weakness, of vulnerability, but it had also been the place where something new had begun. Now sitting in the home that had once felt hollow, David realized that he was no longer alone in carrying the weight of their lives. Together, the three of them were beginning to write a new story, one not defined by loss, but by love chosen freely. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew with a clarity he had not felt in years that they were no longer simply a father and a daughter. They were a family. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And please share this video with your friends and family, because some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.